It's wonderful to have you. And I'd like to, it's an honor and privilege to be introducing to you our speaker today, Dr. Donna El-Kurd, who is Assistant Professor at Doha Institute in Qatar. She holds a PhD in Comparative Politics and International Relations and has focused on authoritarian regimes in the Arab world, state-society relations, and the impact of repression on polarization and social cohesion. She has a number of publications to her name in top-ranking international journals, but the cream of the crop is a book she has published with Oxford University Press on Polarized and Demoralized, Legacies of Authoritarianism in Palestine. That book is available in good bookshops and Amazon, so you're more than welcome to purchase a copy for yourself. And we are quite fortunate that Donna was available to talk to us about her research and her book. And surprise, surprise, the title of the talk today is the title of her book. That is Polarized and Demoralized, Legacies of Authoritarianism in Palestine. The format is we take about 25 to 30 minutes for the presentation, and then you'll all have a chance to share your opinions and raise questions. Zoom gives us the option of raising hands, so feel free to use that function. If by any chance you don't find that function, just raise your hand physically and I'm sure we can find you. I still see some people who don't have their cameras on. If you don't mind turning the camera on, that would be wonderful for all of us. So, Donna, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you to Dr. Dara and Dr. Shahram for hosting me today to discuss my book. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my slides just very quickly here because there are some images I'd like you guys to see. Can everybody see that?
Perfect.
Okay, so so like Dr. Shahram was talking, today I'm going to be just going over some of the results from my book that are relevant to what's happening today in Palestine, especially with impending annexation. In my book, I look specifically on the impact of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank on Palestinian society and how Palestinians organize themselves and face shared challenges. So before I begin, I'm just going to give a brief background of the case for those who might be less familiar. Following the first Palestinian uprising or Intifada, the Palestine Liberation Organization entered into talks with the Israeli government. And what emerged was basically the implementation of a two-state solution through the creation of the Palestinian Authority. The idea was that the PA was going to be given varying levels of control over the West Bank and Gaza to begin with, but eventually that they would take full control over these territories and declare a Palestinian state by 1999. Obviously, since the PA's creation, then the 1999 deadline has passed and there is no Palestinian state. And so many, activists as well as Palestinian scholars and other critical scholars have argued that the PA actually only served as a subcontractor of repression for the Israeli occupation during this time, in the sense that it was a kind of a middleman between Palestinian society and between the Israeli occupation and managed Palestinian society on behalf of the Israeli occupation. Fatah is the most prominent Palestinian political party that is in control of the Palestinian Authority today. There were legislative elections in 2006 in which an Islamist party, Hamas, won a plurality. But following those 2006 elections, with the help of international intervention on the part of the US, somewhat the UK, as well as obviously Israel, the PA essentially led a coup against the Hamas government, and Islamists and other opposition parties since then in the Palestinian Authority controlled areas have become quite repressed. And this is what led to the split between Gaza and the West Bank. So today Gaza is under a Hamas government and the West Bank remains under the Palestinian Authority. And I focus on the West Bank specifically. So, obviously, we're all interested in the case of the Palestinian Authority in and of itself. It's anybody who wants to understand the conflict and the, the future of the Palestinian-Israeli question should be interested in the Palestinian Authority as a topic in and of itself. But I also think that this is a pretty useful case for people who are interested in the dynamics of authoritarianism and polarization, and how the connection between those two things impact the ability of society to mobilize or engage in collective action. So in the book, I outline how the PA is becoming more authoritarian over time, using both primary and secondary data. I basically look at how it relies on authoritarian strategies such as cooptation, by being a major employer of a large swath of society, for example, as well as its increased use of repressive strategies. For example, especially after the 2006 legislative elections, the Palestinian Authority saw an expanded security apparatus. And until very recently, it had increasing coordination with the Israeli occupation. Recently, they kind of cut that off, and we'll discuss what that means. And the PA in recent years has also seen an uptick in the use of torture, arrests, limitations on media and academic freedom. And at the same time, we're seeing Palestinians become more and more divided and more polarized. And I wanted to see exactly how those two dynamics were connected. So just a very basic, look at my argument in this part of the book is that basically I'm saying the PA was able to accomplish something that the Israeli occupation was unable to do. As an indigenous authoritarian regime, it was able to not just repress Palestinians, but also to alter social cohesion and significantly damage the ability of Palestinians to coordinate across party lines and to mobilize in the face of, these existential threats, whether it's the Israeli occupation or now the impending annexation. And I argue in the book that repression causes polarization because it breeds insularity within groups, as well as grievances between them, making it more difficult for groups to initiate mobilization or coordinate with others. So the reason this happens is because in a repressive environment, people don't share, their preferences accurately for fear of crackdown. This is the concept of preference falsification that, popularized and conceptualized by Timur Kuran. But because repression can be selective, so certain groups are targeted and others are not, sharing one's preferences is not just an individual choice or dynamic. It becomes so that you only share within your group, within your in-group, and you don't share your preferences with the out-group. So that's what I mean by increased insularity. And the reason that grievances emerge between groups is because authoritarian strategies breed these in-group and out-group dynamics between those groups that are targeted and those groups that are brought more into the fold of the Palestinian Authority. So the groups that are targeted will have resentments and grievances with those groups that they see are within the regime's fold or doing the regime's bidding. And all of that leads to a decline in mobilization and collective action because these groups no longer know how to work with each other, basically. So I'm not gonna get into the nitty-gritty of the theoretical argument or the causal mechanisms. If people are interested, I have more slides in the at the end. So feel free to ask during the Q&A. But to prove, this argument, I basically take a multi-method approach. I used lab and field experiments as well as qualitative data, including interviews, and an original protest data set that looks at protests, all protests that occurred in the Palestinian Authority areas in the West Bank from 2006 to 2017. And I'll talk more about what these different parts show. So beginning with the experiments, I used experiments in this part of the book and in the second part of the book as well, because experimental methods can isolate the causal effects of variables of interest pretty well. And I conducted these experiments at Birzeit University with university population, because Birzeit is a nationally representative university, and all Palestinians from all walks of life attend this university, so it can kind of mimic broader society. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of what I asked in the laboratory experiment before discussing the results. So laboratory experiments were used to prove that there was a link between authoritarian strategies and polarization, as well as a willingness to engage in collective action. Like I said, it's the first social science experiment at Birzeit, as far as I'm aware. There were some data collection issues that we can discuss, but given the constraints of the case and Israeli raids on the university while I was there and things like that. But basically what I did was over a number of days, I got different groups of students to come into the lab and engage in these experiments together. First, I would ask these students their political affiliation based on campus groups. So there are groups on campus that, again, mimic the groups that exist in broader society. Some are affiliated with Fatah, some are affiliated with Hamas. And so based on that, I can kind of get a sense of what their political affiliation is generally. And then I measured the level of polarization in their views. Polarization here, as is often the case in surveys, is measured as a partisan affiliation and how much it impacts your preferences. So for example, in the United States, if you count yourself as a Republican, how much does being a Republican impact all of your ideas? That's basically how you get a sense of if you're polarized or not in surveys. And then what I did is I used a priming component. So the respondents were split up randomly into 3 groups. Some were reminded of the Palestinian Authority's co-optation mechanisms by reading a little vignette. Another group was reminded of the Palestinian Authority's repression. And then the last group was reminded of just a neutral condition, unrelated to these 2 things. Basically the idea is to see if these prompts change behavior. And then I measured their attitudes again, and then I took some behavioral measures such as their willingness to sign a petition with another group, or their willingness to engage in a campus activity with another group, just to get different impressions of how this prime affected them. So again, I have the full results with the statistical analysis in the appendix slides if people are interested. But basically what I found is that repression led to a decline in willingness to engage in collective action, but specifically for what I call the targeted groups. So again, Fatah is the one that's in charge. They're the ones in power. When they're reminded of repression, it doesn't impact their behavior. But when Islamist students or leftist students are reminded of repression, it drastically impacts their behavior. They are much less willing to engage with, groups of a different political party. And so I found some evidence to suggest that my initial argument is correct. But I wanted to see if this actually played out outside the lab. So I collected qualitative data, including interviews with leftist activists from a number of different groups, like Mobilized, the Palestinian National Initiative, Palestinian Communist Party, and PFLP. Some of these groups work within the Palestinian Authority and some don't. So I just, I'd ask the activists, how the PA affected how they functioned, whether or not they were willing to coordinate with other groups, if they had, grievances with other groups, all of the things that I wanted to see whether or not they played out outside the lab. And then I also did a process tracing analysis of the Islamist parties since the beginning of the PA in 1993. So I looked at Hamas and Islamic Jihad as the 2 main ones. So I traced the conduct of how these Islamist parties functioned in society, looked at how much they were coordinating with others, levels of insularity over time, just to get a sense of whether or not repression actually impacted how they behaved. So to summarize, there are definitely mechanisms of co-optation at work that isolate different groups from each other. Co-optation particularly targets leftist organizers and organizations through 2 main ways. First is the Hay'a system. So this was a way that activists basically told me grassroots initiatives are incorporated into the Palestinian Authority. So for example, when there were all of these little local grassroots movements emerging to resist the annexation wall and resist land theft as a result of the annexation wall. Then the Palestinian Authority designated, resistance against the annexation wall as a hay'a. So now it's like an official body. And a lot of these activists that used to work on the ground in their villages became employed by the Palestinian Authority. So now they're not working from the village, they're working in Ramallah. And so in that way, that's just one of the ways in which, the Palestinian Authority kind of co-opted some of these things. Another way is that they give, what activists told me was that they give us they set the agenda of what we can do by giving us the illusion of influence. So they would maybe sometimes come to protests, sometimes invite particular leftist leadership, like come to a meeting, let's discuss shared tactics, whatever. And because people don't want to lose a seat at the table, or they don't want to alienate, people in power, they allow the PA to set the agenda more often than not, and tell them, where to protest, when to protest. And that caused, a significant amount of divisions between even leadership of these groups and its, low-ranking membership, and also between different groups. So the groups that work with the PA, started to have friction with the groups that didn't, and even to the point where some of them would call the groups that work with the PA traitors. So the rhetoric became really even ramped up, and it's clear that they don't work with each other the way that they might have done in the past. And in terms of mechanisms of repression, we have the Palestine papers, which was a WikiLeaks dump that showed that even before 2006, even before the Islamists won elections, the US and the UK were getting ready to support a crackdown of Islamist parties in the West Bank. And then afterwards, obviously, they supported what happened. And then also security coordination with Israel enhances the repressive capacity of the PA itself. I use the example of Bassel Araj, who is an activist working in his village outside of Bethlehem to oppose the annexation law, nonviolent protest. The Israelis alerted the Palestinian Authority. That Palestinian Authority arrested him. There was a huge outcry because he was a pretty popular activist and he hadn't committed any crimes. So then the Palestinian Authority felt the need to felt pressure to release him. But before releasing them, they coordinated with the Israeli occupation and the Israeli forces to let them know when and where they were going to release him. Then when he was released, the Israelis attempted to pick him up and he escaped, and then there was they tracked him down, there was a gunfight, and he died. So it's kind of a very stark example of how the Israeli occupation, to neutralize what they see as threats to themselves, ramp up and enhance the ability of the Palestinian Authority to repress as well. And the Palestinian Authority has its own reasoning, whether or not they want to feel like they want to make their Israeli counterparts feel that they're, good partners in this cooperation, whether or not they themselves are annoyed with maybe an activist's criticisms. All these things kind of mutually work together to enhance repression in the area. And with the Islamist group specifically, what we see is a huge shift in how they function before and after the 2006 crackdown. So prior to 2006, Hamas in the West Bank had an active social and political wing, aside from their militant wing. They had charities and social groups and a political party. And now it's very militant and very insular in the West Bank. So even their attacks, even their military, their armed attacks are very secretive, very insular. Some of them are lone wolf attacks. They're not as much of a coordinated effort as they used to be, for two reasons. One, these groups are afraid of repression, and two, they aren't given the space to function in any other way but militancy. So for example, student activists who run for elections in universities under an Islamist banner, they're immediately arrested. They're not engaging in any kind of violent action. They're running for student elections, and yet they are often targeted. So it's like, you give people the impression that there's not any other option but to engage in kind of violent attack. So there's a lot of polarization also between the targeted groups and those that aren't targeted. So when I speak to people in Fateh, when I speak to people who work within the PA, they will, without a shred of irony, will claim that Hamas is like ISIS. The rhetoric has gotten to that point. And alternatively, the groups, the Islamist affiliated activists or sympathizers will look at the Palestinian Authority and say that they're traitors. And this level of, for lack of a better word, vitriol that exists in the Palestinian political discourse really didn't exist, I'd say 10 years ago. So it's really quite a shift. And we see that this is impacting how people also organize together. So do these results actually pan out on the ground when we look at patterns of mobilization? If the PA has a unique impact on polarization and collective action, as I attempt to argue, are the areas of Palestinian Authority actually less mobilized? are the areas of PA control actually less mobilized? So the way that the West Bank is divided gives us a unique opportunity to isolate the impact of the PA on Palestinian society. Today, most Palestinians, 55% of the population, live in Area A, which is the like dark yellow areas of the map, which is mostly urban, although it only contains 18% of the territory. Comparatively, 41% of Palestinians live in Area B, mostly somewhat rural in these areas, and that's 20% of the territory, and that's the green areas on the map. And finally, 1 to 2% of Palestinians live in Area C, 62% of the territory, and that's kind of like the beige area. So the way that the Oslo Accords were negotiated, the Palestinian Authority has the authority to conduct its operations and have its security forces on the ground in Area A. It has the authority somewhat in Area B, so they have to leave at sundown. They can't be there after dark. And then Area C, they're not allowed to function at all. So they're not allowed to have any, boots on the ground, so to speak. That doesn't mean that the Israelis don't also engage in Area A. It's not like completely independent. There are Israeli raids regularly in these areas. But the Palestinian Authority itself has varying levels. So prior to the Palestinian Authority's existence, as expected, where we find mobilization is in these urban areas where obviously there's lots of people, people can coalesce, and there's lots of institutions and ways to kind of channel popular will into protest movement. So urban areas are more mobilized than rural areas in these places. And the first Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising, is an example of this. That's where we see the bulk of protests, is in these urban areas. So if the PA does not have a polarizing effect, as discussed in the previous slides, we should see the same dynamics today. Because it's not like people in Area A have less of a reason to be upset. They're still living under Israeli occupation. So if the Palestinian Authority has no impact, we should see the same pattern. So what I did is I put together an original protest data set. It covered daily protests in every village, town, or neighborhood from 2007 to 2016, which is what I consider like the consolidation of the Palestinian Authority period after the legislative elections that I discussed. And it's based on a number of different sources. I used the Bureau of Statistics for village level data, the Applied Research Institute of Jerusalem. I used the Institute for Palestine Studies chronologies to see daily reports. And the data set has types of mobilization, the date in which it occurred, the location, so whether or not it's in Area A, B, or C, as well as what village, town, or neighborhood, whether it's a rural, urban, a refugee camp setting, the density of Israeli settlements relative to each location. Again, that was data I collected through B'Tselem, and then prior Israeli incursions or repression, whether or not an Israeli raid had happened up to 2 days before the protest. So when we look at the raw data, we have empirical confirmation for the Palestinian Authority's effect. So again, Area A, with the greatest population of Palestinians, features the least number of protests and mobilizations in this period, but by far. Area B and Area C hold the bulk of protests in this time period. And this is in spite of the fact, like I said, that the majority of Palestinians live in Area A. They still suffer limitations on mobility, the threat of Israeli raids, settler violence on a regular basis. So they should have a reason to protest, but they're not. And when you do just a simple ANOVA test to see if these are statistically significant differences, they are highly statistically significant. So, when I was first presenting this, people would say, well, what if it's not the Palestinian Authority that's having this impact? What if it's the fact that there are settlements around these places that are protesting? So I plotted the settlement density of each governorate beside the average number of protests at a given month. And what we find is that there's not really a clear relationship between settlement density and the average number of protests. There are governorates that have low levels of settlement density or lower levels and have high levels of protests and vice versa. And when we look at whether or not maybe it's Israeli raids that are doing this, so like maybe people are just protesting in reaction, and it has nothing to do with the Palestinian Authority. Again, we don't really find a clear relationship there either. So there's places that have high levels of incursions that have low levels of protest and vice versa as well. And we see that across governorates, so these are how the Palestinian Authority organizes itself, as well as across area. But obviously, you know, descriptive data can sometimes be misleading, and you know, you don't maybe get the full picture with just descriptive data. So I also ran regression models, a linear hurdle model and a zero inflated negative binomial regression. Again, if people are interested, we can discuss more of this, but the idea is to incorporate all of these variables and account for them at the same time to see if I'm still finding results on my main dependent variable. And I use a linear hurdle model because it's a count variable, the dependent variable is a count variable. So just to give a summary, I guess, of this, the model shows that there is statistical significance for both area B and area C, meaning that even when you account for settlement density, Israeli rates, population numbers, all of the things that we think might have an impact on whether or not people protest, people are still protesting way more in area B and area C than they are in area A. And those areas are a proxy for how much the Palestinian Authority has control of these areas. So, you know, all of these things that I'm discussing doesn't account for the full difference. The areas in which the PA controls the most and has the most impact on society and how people coordinate with each other, those are the areas that we're seeing are least mobilized. And they happen to be the areas where most Palestinians live. So what does this all mean? Well, I try to show that there is a link between authoritarian strategies, so the PA's increased authoritarianism, and with polarization and willingness to engage in collective action. And I show that through a variety of ways, that it's because this kind of authoritarianism and authoritarian strategies are breeding insularity and grievance. And in the Palestine case, it explains why there's a lack of coordination between different groups in facing the Israeli occupation or even the PA's repression itself. And it's confirmed empirically when we look at the patterns of mobilization. So in terms of a theoretical contribution, it can be kind of a starting point for understanding how the practice of authoritarianism can impact social interaction. And it can, I think it could be applied to other contexts in the Middle East. So in the book, I have a chapter where I look at Iraqi Kurdistan and Bahrain as well, using the same argument. And it helps us to understand how even when political openings occur, the legacies of authoritarianism can erode effective opposition. So what does that mean for Palestine today? What we're finding is that, you know, even as annexation looms, we have very, very few protests. And it's because of this legacy of the Palestinian Authority's impact. And mobilization, even, you know, before annexation even, has increasingly become pushed to the margins. And by margins, I mean the areas where we wouldn't expect to see mobilization under normal contexts. Villages, smaller areas, places that are, you know, outside the Palestinian Authority's control, places like Jerusalem, where the Palestinian Authority is not allowed to function at all, where there's a high level of repression on Palestinians there. But that's where we're seeing mobilization, even if it's short-term mobilization, even if it's focused on short-term objectives, that's where we're seeing mobilization. We're not seeing mobilization in the same way we used to from these strongholds of Palestinian population centers, basically like Ramallah and all of these other places that used to mobilize in high levels. And I also have a forthcoming work where I look at polling data and preferences for armed resistance have gone up, especially since the Trump administration coming to power. Why? Because nonviolent resistance has been neutralized effectively. You know, people have a sense that their capacity for nonviolent action is not there, and nonviolent action is going to be ineffective. So all of this to say, this bodes poorly, and you know, with you know, annexation, it may not have happened July 1st, but this is an ongoing process, and it wasn't tied to a date. So it bodes poorly for the future of Palestinian resistance and the conflict, given the impact of the Palestinian Authority over time on Palestinian society. So I think that's all I have. Thank you so much for allowing me to talk at you through this venue. Let me just stop sharing my screen here, and I'm open to your questions.
Yes, thank you, Dana. You've covered a lot of ground for us. If you, So for questions, we'll take questions as they appear. I see that Rifai is raising his hand, but can you please try and use the raise hand function? If you can't find it, Rifai, I've already noted you, so it's fine. Let's start with Rifai. Dara, will you take care of the unmute situation?
I will. Sorry, Rifai, I just have to find you.
Can I mute myself?
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't find the hand motion.
That's okay.
Thank you so much for organizing this amazing talk. Thank you so much, Dana, for this great presentation. Really loved it. And I guess I have like a comment and a question. I noted a lot of similarities with your main argument about increased repression and less mobilization, popular mobilization. And I wonder if, and then in the end, you mentioned that the preference for violence has increased. Has it actually increased? Like the application of violence, has it increased since the PA increased its repression? I could see that in the Syrian case, for instance, this is where I saw a lot of similarities with increased regime repression in Syria. There were less mobilization because there was basically no space for it, and increased not only preference, but application of violence by a lot of activists who believed in the non-violent aspect in the beginning, but then they were disillusioned. Do you see the same dynamic happening in Palestine? And if not, then why hasn't that happened? And I hope it doesn't, but I'm just curious. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Dana, floor is yours.
Yeah, sure. So thank you so much for your question. So what we find is that the Palestinian authorities, combined repression with the Israeli occupation's repression has been quite effective at, limiting the amount of violence that targets Israeli institutions and Israeli soldiers and Israeli citizens. So I think now it's like an average of like something like 30 incidents, where I think something like 30 incidents a month. Don't quote me on that. I'll have to check the exact number. But whereas it used to be in the hundreds. So they've actually been quite effective at tamping down the use of violence. Not only because of the, this impact on social cohesion, they've essentially destroyed many of the groups that were willing to engage in violent action in the West Bank. Also, there's the geographic situation. The annexation wall exists now in a way that did not before. So there's like less access also for those people who would be willing to engage in violence. However, we do still see bouts of violence. And when we ask in the polling, we're talking about, so basically what we ask them is, if the Palestinian Authority collapsed, what would you think that we should do next? Do you think we should engage in armed resistance? Or do you think we should engage in nonviolent resistance? Or do you think we should appeal to the international community? There's a couple of different choices. And what we find is that a plurality prefer violent action. And it's going up. This is corroborated by polls by Khalid Shaqaqi in the Palestinian Survey Research Center, but also with the polls that I conducted with the Arab Opinion Index. So it's pretty clear that people prefer armed resistance. Now, given that they don't have the infrastructures to engage in armed resistance the way that they used to, what does that mean? Well, we can look at Jerusalem as a pretty good microcosm of what might happen. We had, in the 2013-14, we had like the knife intifada. These are completely uncoordinated attacks. People, basically people dubbed it like a violence of despair. Palestinians would go out and use knives because they don't have access to other kinds of weapons, and they don't also have access even to a coordinated violent attack. So they did engage in lots of violence. They, this violence of despair using just household items. So my kind of takeaway for your question is, whereas I know that it's not going to be, we're not going to get the same levels of suicide bombing, for example, as we once did, but it still might be quite a terrible situation in the West Bank if the Palestinian Authority collapses, given what exists on the ground now. People might still engage in violence. It's just not in the way that we imagine violence to look like, or how we've seen it in the past.
Thank you.
So next up, we've got Najim Dean, who I've asked to unmute.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Dana, for that presentation. My question is very simple. Do we find any polarization between those who support non-violence and those who support violence in your research? And how much to what extent does this polarization indicate the success of the resistance towards the Israeli occupation? Thank you.
So if I understand the question correctly, you're saying, is there a polarization not just between political groups, between Fatah and Hamas or whatever, but also between people who support violence and non-violence?
Yes.
Okay, so let me reframe what I mean by polarization quickly. It's actually become a polarization around the role of the Palestinian Authority itself. So people who still buy in to this project of the Palestinian Authority and to the two-state solution, and people who no longer think that this is a relevant project. That's kind of the line that we're seeing. In terms of a polarization between those who support violence and non-violence, so again, it's forthcoming work, so I'm still working on it. But basically what I find is that those who have a sense that that there is no social cohesion, or like very little social cohesion. So we asked them a question about how much they believe social cohesion, exists still in the Palestinian society. Those who feel like Palestinian society is very divided support violence more than those who have a sense that Palestinian society is more cohesive. And that actually, that's very well supported in the literature. Because nonviolence takes a lot of coordination. It takes more coordination than violence. It takes a large amount of people to be effective. So if you have a sense that a large amount of people aren't going to be working together, that you don't think that they can work together, you think that society is very divided, you're less likely to support nonviolence because you don't think it's effective at all. You don't think it can actually happen. Whereas the people who have the sense that no, society is still pretty cohesive, we still can work together, those are the people that are more likely to support nonviolence. That's a pretty clear relationship that we're finding in the data so far.
Fascinating.
Thank you.
So we had a question from Sarah. It's a written question. I'm just trying to unmute her now. She might be able to ask it.
Hello, hi. Thank you, Dana, for the amazing presentation. I was wondering about the out-group, in-group polarity that you started off by mentioning at the beginning. And I wonder, when you speak about mobilizations in the West Bank, are we talking about the outer group, lefties, Islamists, whoever's are not, supporters of the PA, mobilizing, or are we talking about neutral people or even Fatah supporters or Fatah members who have had enough of the situation and mobilizing? So who are we talking about when you speak about mobilizing groups?
Yeah, so I am talking to some degree about opposition, but also a lot of a lot of the mobilization that we're seeing is not necessarily partisan. It's not supported by a single group. It does even include people who are Fatah. For example, when we see the mobilizations happening in villages like Bil'ain and Nil'ain and Nabi Saleh and Kufr Qasim, like all these places, they have local groups that might encompass different kinds of people. And like I said to the earlier question, it's really sorry about that. It's really a question. So when I say in group and out today, it's really a question of those who are still bought into the Palestinian Authority and those who are not. And it's less like they're not those who no longer believe in the Palestinian Authority or no longer employed by the Palestinian Authority might actually be Fatah, in terms of their political backgrounds. But it's more like people who have kind of bought in to the project and those who no longer believe it's effective. Does that answer your question?
Next up, we've got a question from Ben.
Hi, Dana. Look, I just want to start by saying I think that was brilliant. It was really wonderfully presented, and the mix of your sort of theoretical position and then the rich empirical material that you've gone out and collected is really impressive, and really well done. That's excellent work. I just have a couple of questions. The first one, probably a bit provocative, but I was really impressed by this idea of outsourcing oppression. But of course, it's not a new idea, right? If you look at the colonial period, this is a very tried and true method of sort of what colonial occupations do, that you empower one element or one sector, whether it be ethnic or religious or political, of the sort of local peoples, and they're obviously going to kind of do the repression on your behalf, because their position is always tenuous, because they can never be fully legitimate and fully have sovereignty over territory because they're under occupation. So I just wonder whether you have any thoughts on that, or whether that's one bridge too far, whether this is a sort of deliberate colonial strategy that they deployed deliberately, or whether it sort of was just a happy outcome for the Israeli occupation, that this authoritarianism went on under this oversight, under their oversight. And my second question is, I wasn't quite clear on how we define authoritarianism here, because I think it is important to define, if we're going to argue that that what's going on here is a kind of return to authoritarianism, or a new form of authoritarianism under this outsourcing of oppression, because there is, of course, a lot of literature that deals with hybrid regimes. And the idea here is that you mix kind of traditional democratic mechanisms like elections, media freedoms, some degree of civil society, a relative openness of different political opposition, with traditional authoritarian forms, which you talked about, of cracking down on civil society, controlling civil society and media freedoms, controlling the rule of law. So I was just wondering whether what you've presented doesn't better fit, or whether you've thought about the extent to which it fits under the idea of a hybrid regime that mixes a little bit of all, or whether it really is authoritarian, and if so, how we define that. So that's two questions for you. But thanks, it was brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your questions. Really interesting lens, I think. So you're absolutely right that this is not new. You talked about how in colonial context, they may have used maybe a minority group, other types of groups. Now in this scenario, it's becoming increasingly clear, especially as people do archival research and things like that about that, the time period of the 1990s, it's becoming increasingly clear that the Israelis had no intention of giving state or allowing the state to emerge. It was kind of like kicking the ball to the next step. And what they wanted is they wanted to remove a sense of responsibility for themselves, because as an occupying force, they are responsible. So they wanted that kind of buffer. And in terms of your question, is it deliberate? I think that this was a very reasoned strategy. Now, how they got the broadest political party, like the most popular political party in Palestine, under Fatah, even though, obviously the PLO generally accepted these terms, but there were some factions within the PLO that, resisted and disagreed. But it was mostly Fatah, right? How they got, it wasn't a minority group. It wasn't, you know what I mean? Like it was a group with a lot of legitimacy in Palestinian society. How they got them to buy into that? I think that speaks to some degree the failure of Palestinian leadership on that front. So when you talk about, and that kind of goes into your second question about authoritarianism, is that before the Palestinian Authority existed, Palestinians didn't have a self-government, but they had local groups. Even within the Palestine Liberation Organization, there were kind of mechanisms of accountability. For the PLO to be effective, it needed societal buy-in from Palestinians in the diaspora and on the ground. that means that, I mean, I'm not saying I don't think that we can conceive of a liberation movement as being a democratic liberation movement necessarily. I mean, it's engaged in conflict. So, you know what I mean? Like, it's not like on the top to be a democracy at that point in time, because it's not a governing apparatus. But there are mechanisms of accountability. When we look at the grassroots institutions in historic Palestine, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in Gaza, they are accountable to people. And what I mean by authoritarianism today is that the Palestinian Authority has become basically unaccountable to people. When so a part of my book that I didn't discuss in the presentation, because you could leave me to talk forever, so I thought I'd cut it off, is as I do these interviews with people, with elites in the Palestinian Authority. And you see it time and again that they have rationalized to themselves why Palestinian society cannot have democracy right now. We cannot be accountable to Palestinian society. Elections have completely been, ignored. In addition to the repressive strategies that, like I talked about, crackdowns, arrests, even, cyber repression. Palestinians can't even write something on Facebook anymore. So I would say that it is highly authoritarian. I'm not sure that it really makes it makes a clear difference for Palestinians on the ground exactly what type of authoritarian regime we would classify it as necessarily. Really, the difference to them is how it used to be and how it is now. How was it before the Palestinian Authority? How much access did we have to our leadership? How much did they actually listen? And today, and I think that that's a huge chasm. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my first thought.
Thank you.
I've actually got a question myself, if you don't mind, Dana. I was wondering, why does the Palestinian Authority act in an authoritarian way? Is it something to do with its roots in the groups it came out of in the PLO? Is it something to do with the experience of, coexisting and challenging Israel? Is it related to its international benefactors? Why is it? Has it adopted?
Yeah. So in my book, I hone in on the fact that it is what I call like a penetrated regime. So like it's very, so I use a principal agent framework, and I say how the Palestinian Authority, it should be an agent of the Palestinian people, but it has another, dynamic that it needs to consider, which is the international dimension. So I highlight in the book, in one of the chapters, kind of the international intervention and how it impacts how they function, even on like a very micro level. So like if they have trainings at the Interior Ministry, they need to get the roster of who they want to be trained approved by the US counterpart. And the US counterpart often is involved in removing people who might be politicized or might have a history of mobilization or may have been arrested in the First Intifada, all of these things. The aid is very conditional. And even though there's lots of sources of aid, so we have EU aid, we have Japanese aid, we have Gulf aid, we have whatever, but from my discussions with a lot of the people who work with the international aid within the Palestinian Authority, they basically told me like the US is the one that sets the rules. And every other country, like there's not another line that they're pursuing. They're all pursuing the US line. So some of it is aid, some of it is direct intervention in the functionings of the Palestinian Authority, and some of it is their very stark lesson after 2006, which is we had fair and free elections, and you pushed us to engage in a different way. You pushed us to not only repressing Palestinians, but like hundreds of people died because of the conflict that happened in 2006. So really, when you talk to the Palestinian Authority elites and the people who work within the Palestinian Authority at decision-making levels, they tell you like, what have we accomplished by being accountable? They're just going to crack down on us. We don't want the same level of conflict. We don't want more splits. We've already lost Gaza. We're already so divided. So it's really that international consideration, I would say, the fact that it had very little sovereignty to begin with. And not to like just pin the blame on the international dimension. I'm sure some people might have some arguments about, people have written about like Yasser Arafat's role, how he wasn't, necessarily committed to democratic accountability. But I think that that's kind of overstated. The more clear answer is there's direct intervention in how they function and how they're allowed to function. Yeah, sorry, there are questions coming up.
I see that Riyadh has used that function to raise his hand.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, very good, Riyadh.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dana, for this excellent presentation and analysis. Dana, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the PA, threatened that he would disengage with the Israeli apparatus, security apparatus, if they go ahead with the with the annexation plans. Given the fact that the two security apparatuses here are so enmeshed and entangled as tools of oppression for the Palestinians, on the Palestinians, can that be easily done? I mean, or is that just a threat?
I mean, Mahmoud Abbas has threatened many times to cut security coordination. I would say that this time he's gone the farthest. The Palestinian Authority has gone the farthest in cutting security coordination. Before they would say we're going to cut security coordination and still like coordinate up to like a 95% level. Today there is a cut to security coordination between the Israeli occupation forces and the PA. What they're doing apparently is if there's like a threat to Israeli security, the PA isn't informing Israel, it's informing third parties to inform Israel. So it's like they're still somewhat fulfilling the role, but they are purposely slowing down the process to make the Israelis feel like, you know, a consequence of what you're about to do is this might erupt and devolve in a way that we're not going to control. But also we have historically a precedent where during the Second Intifada, parts of the Palestinian Authority's security apparatus did, you know, enter into conflict with the Israeli occupation forces, and they entered into, you know, armed conflict with the Israeli occupation forces. Now, that's not to say that I think that they can, you know, say we're ending security coordination and continue to exist the way that they do. I think that the Palestinian Authority is at a crucial moment. And actually, I've been arguing this since Trump cut aid to the Palestinian Authority. So, like, really now, the PA is facing a situation where it's quite terrible, and it has an impact on Palestinians on the ground. You know, people who can't get medical attention, who can't move from place to place. All of these things are being impacted because of the situation where coordination is being cut. But at the same time, it's like a kind of an opportunity where the PA is not as beholden to the Americans as they have been. The PA's leadership can take drastic steps and kind of be, you know, the international community would be much more understanding of the fact that they would take drastic steps to perhaps reevaluate, you know, how their institutions function at all. Do you see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. If leadership actually, you know, could be brave, take that step to reevaluate the Palestinian Authority altogether, this is the moment to do so because of the circumstances. And I'm not sure that they're going to go beyond threats, but they've gone the farthest they've ever done.
Okay, we have time for one final question. If you could keep that brief. I think I saw Ian raise his hand physically. I don't know if he still wants to ask a question, but
we also have a question from Basma, who's written to me.
All right, so let's see if we can unmute Ian.
Okay, look, I'll be brief. Dana, it's very good to see you again. I met you in November last year in Doha. That really is quite fascinating research. I just wanted to clarify a couple of points. I think I understood you to say that your research had been conducted primarily among university students, or people at that age group, or is it broader across the West Bank?
It's broader. Just one aspect was conducted with university students.
Okay, so this tendency towards moving towards violence because of frustration with the.
That's a public poll. That's a public poll. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's going right across the board then.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Does it have any applicability to the Palestinians who are resident of Israel?
No, so it's only in the West Bank and Gaza, and for my purposes, I focus on the West Bank. The poll itself, the survey, was only conducted in the territories.
Okay then. All right. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Donna, for this really engaging and empirically rich presentation. We really enjoyed it. I am going to see if what the function is for us to unmute all. I think I've just done that. Please join me in thanking Donna for her wonderful presentation. And since I have you all as my captive audience, I'd like to bring to your attention our next webinar. We are staying in that part of the world. We'll be looking at Gaza. Next time we convene, it's going to be on the 19th of August at the same time, 5 p.m. Melbourne time. And we have two speakers with us, Professor Michelle Pace and Haim Yacoubi will be talking to us about the situation in the Gaza Strip. So look forward to seeing you again. And thank you for being with us. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.